Northwest of a small city in Cambodia, a rectangle of water stretches nearly 8 kilometers into the distance. It is not a natural lake. It is a reservoir built into the landscape by Angkorian engineers. Its embankments raised from earth, moved and packed by human labor, without modern earth-moving machinery, nearly 1,000 years ago. It is called the West Beret. Of the 4 great reservoirs built at Angkor, this is the only one that still holds water today. The reservoir is not alone. Canals approach it from across the surrounding plain. Some roads also acted as embankments, redirecting water across the plain. Around all of it lie the faint traces of settlement, mounds and ponds that barely rise above the surrounding fields, easy to miss unless you already know to look for them. This is Angkor. Most people who picture Angkor picture its temples. Angkor Wat, its towers, its stone corridors, its carvings. That image is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. The temples are only part of Angkor. Beyond them lies a landscape built on purpose: reservoirs, canals, embankments, settlements, stretching across hundreds of square kilometers. For generations, much of its true scale stayed hidden. Decades before anyone had the tools to map this landscape in full, one researcher had already argued that Angkor could only be understood at the scale of everything around it. Not the temples alone, but the water, the roads, and the land they moved through. Parts of his argument would become deeply contested. The evidence to actually test it did not yet exist. It would take most of a century and technology no one at Angkor could have imagined to find out how right he was and where he was not. That argument, and everything that came after it, is where this story is going. But it starts here, at the water. Stand at the edge of the West Beret today, and it feels almost natural, still, wide, reflecting the sky. The reservoir remains part of the region's water management today, drawn on for irrigation. At its center, barely visible above the waterline, sits a small, ruined temple called the West Mebon, built on an island Angkorian engineers placed deliberately at the reservoir's geometric heart. Nothing about this place announces what it actually is. A visitor could stand here for an hour and see only a peaceful, oversized lake. What that visitor would not see, without knowing where to look, is a single, deliberate piece of something built to work as a whole, engineered by people who reshaped an entire plain to hold, move, and release water on a monumental scale. The reservoir's dikes alone represent an immense volume of earth, raised in tall, continuous embankments around a rectangle of open water, large enough that its far shore genuinely blurs into the horizon. Whatever else is true about how this landscape functioned, it required a state capable of mobilizing labor on an extraordinary scale. This is only one of Angkor's great reservoirs, inside a much larger network of smaller canals, moats, and embankments threading across the entire plain. Multiply what stands here by everything else this documentary is about to describe, and the scale of the underlying question comes into focus. What kind of civilization builds something like this, again and again, for 400 years? None of this happened first. Long before anyone dug the first channel of this reservoir, Before there was a city here at all, this plain already had people on it, farming communities, sacred sites, and rival centers of power. Understanding the water means understanding what came before the water. That story starts further back, on a plateau most people today have never heard of, with a claim far more complicated than it first appears. Centuries before, there was an empire historians call Khmer. Chinese writers described a powerful polity in the lower Mekong world. They called it Funan. Funan left almost no writing of its own that survives. Nearly everything known about it comes from Chinese court records. Descriptions of envoys, merchants, and tribute missions passing through a wealthy trading world in the Mekong Delta, roughly straddling what is now southern Vietnam and Cambodia. Archaeology confirms that this region held real urbanized trading communities from the early first millennium onward. What archaeology has not confirmed is the tidy version of the story. One coherent kingdom, with a single capital, a clean beginning, and an orderly line of kings. Later, historians often tried to turn that Chinese label into a more coherent territorial kingdom than the archaeological evidence now actually supports. The more accurate picture is messier and more interesting. Chinese writers used the name Funan for a polity or network of polities in the lower Mekong world. The archaeology beneath that single name is considerably more complicated than their accounts made it sound. By the 6th and 7th centuries, Chinese accounts begin using another name for the region, Genla, usually rendered in English as Chenla. Cambodian inscriptions from this period, written in Sanskrit and in an early form of Khmer, reveal several competing and overlapping centers of power, not a single successor state cleanly replacing Funan on a map. One of those centers stood out. Under a king named Isanavarman in the early 7th century, a capital called Isanapura became one of the most important political centers in the region, its authority reaching across a wide network of allied and subordinate territories. It did not hold together indefinitely. After the death of the king Jayavarman I, sometime around the year 681, the balance of power he had maintained came apart. By the early 8th century, Chinese sources begin distinguishing what they called land Genla and water Genla, a northern inland grouping and a southern coastal one. Whether those labels describe two genuinely coherent kingdoms, looser regional groupings, or simply a distinction that made more sense from a Chinese vantage point than a Khmer one, remains debated among historians who work with these sources directly. Into this fractured, contested world, a man was born, probably in the later 8th century. His name was Jayavarman. Almost everything known about his early life comes from inscriptions carved generations after his death, court histories written to justify the legitimacy of later kings, tracing their line back to him, not eyewitness accounts from his own lifetime. That distinction matters. It means his biography, as it survives today, is memory reshaped by people with a clear reason to shape it in a particular direction. By the end of the 8th century, later inscriptions place Jayavarman in a landscape of competing Khmer centers, one ruler among several with no single seat of authority anywhere on the horizon. One inscription states that he came from Java before his rise. Whether Java means the island we know by that name, or something different in the geography of the period, remains debated. What happened next is known to us almost entirely through a single inscription, carved 250 years later. The Stok Kak Tom inscription, dated to 1052, describes a ceremony that took place in the year 802 on a sandstone plateau called Phnom Kulen. According to that later text, a Brahmin priest performed a ritual intended to ensure that the Khmer world, called Cambodia, would no longer be dependent on Java. The same inscription connects that ceremony to a sacred royal institution it calls the Devaraja. What that word actually meant in practice has been debated by historians for generations. Later writers often rendered it simply as God King, a straightforward personal divine title. The reality, as best as inscriptions and scholarship can reconstruct it, was more complicated. An institution bound up with royal ritual, legitimacy, and a specific religious office, whose exact mechanics remain only partly understood, filtered to us through a text written 2.5 centuries after the fact. Historians traditionally use 802 to mark the beginning of the Angkorian age. It is worth being honest about what that date actually represents. It is not a contemporary proclamation, preserved in Jayavarman's own words. It is a boundary drawn by later royal memory, a story later kings told about their own origins, more than 3 generations after anyone who might have witnessed the actual ceremony was still alive to correct it. Angkorian kingship, across the 4 centuries that followed, would draw on more than any single ceremony or title. Royal ancestry, temple foundations, land and labor endowments, military success, and shifting currents of Hindu and Buddhist ideas about rulership all played their part. There is a second reason Phnom Kulen matters to this story, and it has nothing to do with a ceremony recorded generations later. Beneath the forest canopy of the Kulen Plateau, airborne laser scanning has revealed something modern archaeologists did not expect to find. An entire early urban landscape laid out on a deliberate grid, threaded with roads, dotted with shrines, and anchored by a large reservoir that was apparently never finished. Researchers now call this early city Mahendra Parvata. The survey found dozens of temples and shrines scattered across the plateau, connected by a formal grid of roads and water channels, evidence of real planning, not organic, accidental growth. And at the heart of it all sat that unfinished reservoir, begun, but apparently never completed on the scale its builders intended. Whether that reflects a shift in royal attention, a technical difficulty, or simply the plateau's own limitations as a long-term capital, is a question the survey itself cannot answer. These are possibilities worth asking, not conclusions the evidence has settled. Mahendra Parvata's time as a royal capital appears to have been relatively short. But the plateau itself was not simply abandoned once the court moved on. Inscriptions describe continued worship and pilgrimage there throughout the Angkorian period, and soil and pollen evidence points to extensive, intensive human use of the land, stretching from the 8th century into the 12th. Renovation, transformation, and ongoing activity across a span of centuries, long after Phnom Kulen had stopped being anyone's capital. The material remains show that water, movement, and settlement were already being planned together on this plateau, well before the mature city on the plain below reached anything like its eventual scale. The same landscape-scale problems Angkor would later confront on the plain were already being confronted here. The inscriptions that survive from this same broad period reinforce the picture of a genuinely fragmented political world. Local lords across the region left their own dedications, claiming their own titles and their own religious foundations, in language that suggests real, independent authority within their own domains, not simply provincial governors administering territory on behalf of a distant crown. Jayavarman II ruled for decades after Phnom Kulen, consolidating what he had claimed against rivals who did not simply vanish because a ceremony had been performed. What he did not do, what none of his immediate successors did, right away, was build anything resembling the landscape this documentary is actually about. That work belonged to the kings who came after him. Indravarman I took the throne around the year 877, ruling from a capital called Hariharalaya, modern Roluos, a short distance from where the great temples of Angkor would eventually rise. He did not waste time. An inscription from his reign, carved at a temple called Preah Ko, records his own declared intention almost immediately after taking power. Within days, he said, he would begin digging. He meant it. Indravarman ordered the construction of a reservoir called the Indratataka, nearly 4 kilometers long, 800 meters wide, one of the largest works yet attempted by an Angkorian ruler. Its scale announced a new phase in royal construction, one that later kings would build on, expand, and eventually surpass many times over. Alongside the water, Indravarman built in stone. At Preah Ko, consecrated in the year 880, he raised a temple honoring royal ancestors, its towers dedicated according to the temple's own inscriptions to earlier rulers and their queens. A year later came Bakong, often described as the first great Angkorian temple mountain, a stepped pyramid in stone enclosed by 2 moats dedicated to the god Shiva. Water, royal ancestry, and sacred kingship expressed in monumental stone. These ideas would recur throughout Angkorian history in different combinations at different scales for the next 400 years. What exactly these reservoirs were for is not as simple a question as it might first appear. Their existence, their scale, and their engineering are not in doubt. Angkorian berets stored and redistributed enormous volumes of water across a landscape with a sharply seasonal climate. Heavy monsoon rains for part of the year, a pronounced dry season for the rest. Their ritual significance is also strongly supported. A great reservoir ringed by causeways with a temple on an island at its center has often been understood as evoking the mythic ocean believed to surround Mount Meru, the sacred center of the universe in Khmer cosmology. What remains genuinely debated is how directly these reservoirs fed the rice fields that sustained Angkor's population. How much of that stored water actually reached the fields? By what routes? How centralized that management really was, and how much changed over 4 centuries of continuous modification as later kings added, altered, and expanded on what earlier ones had built. It is worth being precise about where the real uncertainty sits. That this landscape stored and moved enormous volumes of water on purpose, at genuine engineering scale, is not seriously contested by anyone who has studied it closely. What remains open is a narrower, harder question. Whether that water moved primarily to serve agriculture at the scale needed to feed a very large population, or whether its role was more mixed, part practical water management, part sacred symbol, part urban infrastructure serving households and temples directly, with large-scale rice irrigation playing a smaller part in the total system than earlier generations of scholars assumed. This question would come to define one of the longest-running arguments in the entire field of Angkor archaeology, an argument this documentary will follow directly later. Indravarman's son inherited the throne and expanded the scale of royal construction considerably. Yasovarman I took power around 889, and he did not stay at Hariharalaya. He moved the capital itself, north and east, onto the plain that would come to be called Angkor. He founded a new city there, Yashodarapura, and began building on a scale that dwarfed anything attempted before him. His reservoir, the East Barai, covered several times the surface area of the Indratataka his father had dug barely a decade earlier. And rather than build an artificial mountain from nothing, as Indravarman had at Bakong, Yasovarman crowned a real, natural hill, Phnom Bakeng, with his state temple, sacralizing the existing landscape itself rather than replacing it with something wholly artificial. He did not forget where he came from. At Lole, built on an island inside his father's own reservoir, Yasovarman raised a temple honoring Indravarman directly, continuing the pattern of ancestor commemoration, even as he expanded the kingdom's ambitions far beyond the scale of anything built before him. The East Barai was not simply a bigger version of what came before it. It had an engineered inlet in its northeastern corner and a major outlet in its eastern bank, tying it physically into the wider network of channels that carried water across the plain. At its center, on an artificial island, King Rajendravarman II later raised the East Mebon. 4 landing stages at its base still preserve the logic of a temple once reached only by boat. The arrangement echoed Lole, which Yasovarman himself had built in his father's reservoir, another island temple set within royal waterworks, now repeated at the center of the much larger East Barai in a later reign. Later construction did not simply add to this landscape from empty ground. Older waterworks were modified, cut through, embanked again in places, and connected to newer channels as the urban landscape changed around them. Successive projects were often layered into ground earlier rulers had already shaped. The accumulation this documentary keeps returning to was not additive in any simple sense. It was a landscape continuously rebuilt on itself. The system was not created in a single reign. It accumulated through successive royal foundations and later modifications, project by project, across generations. None of what the last section described was empty ceremony, built for its own sake and left standing unused. People lived inside it, hundreds of thousands of them, spread across a landscape that looked nothing like a conventional city of its era. Angkor was not dense the way most historical capitals were dense. Rice paddies, garden plots, and open agricultural land sat directly inside the urban fabric, woven between houses and temples, rather than pushed out to some separate countryside beyond a wall. Archaeologists call this pattern low-density urbanism, a city and its farmland functioning as one continuous space. At its apogee in the 13th century, one recent, comprehensive model, combining LiDAR mapping, decades of excavation data, and radiocarbon dating, places the population of Greater Angkor somewhere between 700,000 and 900,000 people, distributed across the enormous Greater Angkor settlement complex. That figure is not a census. It comes from modeling settlement density across a landscape this large, using excavation data and mapped occupation evidence, a genuine scholarly estimate, with real uncertainty built into it. Even so, by that estimate, Angkor stands among the largest known low-density pre-industrial urban complexes documented anywhere on Earth. What do we actually know about the people who made up that population? Not as much as a modern census would offer, and not organized into the clean pyramid a general history textbook might suggest. Angkorian inscriptions do not give us a census of social classes. What they give us is something more specific and in some ways more revealing. Lists. Officials assigned to temple administration, priests and religious specialists, dancers, cooks, and craft workers. Villages and fields formally assigned to temple foundations, along with the people obligated to work them. The record that survives is administrative, and it comes overwhelmingly from an elite, temple-centered point of view. But the sheer range of named occupations it preserves tells us something real about how many different kinds of labor sustained these foundations. Inscriptions and archaeology are one kind of evidence. A single outside eyewitness left us another. In 1296, a Chinese envoy named Zhou Daguan arrived at Angkor as part of a diplomatic mission and stayed roughly 11 months, late in Angkor's imperial history. When he returned home, he wrote an account of what he had seen. The only detailed surviving eyewitness account of Angkor written by a foreign visitor who actually lived there during the city's 13th century life. The text that survives is probably only a shortened version of what Zhou originally wrote, translated and retranslated by scholars for over a century. But what remains offers something inscriptions alone cannot: an outsider's plain description of ordinary things. He described houses built up on posts, roofed with thatch, arranged according to rank, the grandest reserved for the palace and the temples, ordinary households considerably simpler. He noticed visible differences in clothing according to rank and status. He described a daily market and was struck enough by women's prominence in it to write it down directly. Trade in this city, by his account, ran substantially through women's hands. Even a detail as small as how people cooked survives in his account. He noted that households buried 3 stones in the ground to form a simple hearth, the basic technology of an ordinary Angkorian kitchen. He described the city's gates, and separately, he described a royal procession he witnessed. Troops, banners, music, palace women, guards, officials, elephants, and the king himself holding a sacred sword. He recorded boats as ordinary transport on the city's canals and moats, and noted that cattle were used to haul carts, reminders of the movement of people and goods that the surviving stone monuments alone say nothing about. He also described common household objects and cooking practices in more general terms: earthenware pots and rice prepared in ways that struck him, as a visitor from China, as distinctly different from his own experience. This is one man's outside impression, filtered through his own assumptions and the limits of an 11-month stay, not a comprehensive record of Angkorian life. But it is a genuine eyewitness account, and it puts human texture on everything. The inscriptions and the archaeology described from a greater distance. He also left one of the few outside descriptions of the walled city itself, Angkor Thom. A wide moat encircled the walls, crossed by causeways lined with carved stone figures, gods pulling one half of a great serpent, demons pulling the other, a scene from Hindu myth stretched across solid stone. 5 gates pierced the walls, each crowned with massive carved faces looking outward in every direction. By his account, the gates stood open and guarded through the day and were closed at night. He noted that the market operated on a fixed daily rhythm, by his account, opening around 6 in the morning and closing by noon, with vendors spreading mats on the ground rather than working from fixed shops. He described most exchange he saw happening through goods rather than a local coinage, rice, other grain, or Chinese goods for small transactions, cloth for larger ones, and gold or silver at the highest values. He also recorded some use of Chinese copper cash, a detail archaeology is only beginning to illuminate, since coin finds from this period remain genuinely rare. One detail complicates the popular image of Angkor's temples as sealed, purely sacred spaces, closed off entirely from ordinary daily life. Excavation and mapping inside the enclosure of Angkor Wat itself have identified something unexpected. Earthen residential mounds, household ponds, scattered ceramics, and other traces of what was very likely perishable wood and thatch domestic architecture. The mounds, ponds, ceramics, and other traces of these structures describe residential occupation that the surviving stone architecture alone would never reveal. That occupation was not evenly continuous. The evidence points to changing patterns of use over time, including a real gap before renewed activity in the enclosure during the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Reading that shift precisely is difficult work, dependent on careful excavation rather than surface impression. What is not in doubt is that people lived and worked inside these walls, in ways the temple's grand stone architecture alone would never suggest to a casual visitor. At Ta Prohm, a separate line of evidence tells a related story. An inscription associated with the temple describes an enormous dependent staff and an extensive economic network tied to its upkeep, a huge number of people, named by occupation, whose labor and produce supported the institution. That inscriptional record and the archaeological evidence for residential occupation inside temple enclosures, more broadly, are 2 different kinds of evidence, pointing in a compatible direction without being the same finding. Fine-grained excavation near one of Angkor's later temples, at a site called Kok Phnof, adds a further layer: long-lived occupation and craft production, including ceramic manufacture, continuing across centuries in a district that combined ceremonial space with the ordinary residential and productive life of a working neighborhood. Roads and canals, temples and neighborhoods, fields and city. The boundaries between Angkor's categories were rarely as clean as they might sound from 9 centuries' distance. Road embankments and canals frequently interacted, sometimes forming genuinely multifunctional infrastructure serving both purposes at once, without being simply interchangeable with one another. And that raises a question nobody actually living inside Angkor needed to ask, because they were simply living inside the answer day to day without ever needing to step back and see the whole. Was this landscape, the water, the roads, the fields, the temples, spread across hundreds of square kilometers and 4 centuries of accumulated construction, one deliberately connected system, engineered and maintained as a whole? Or was it many separate projects, built by many separate kings across many separate generations, that simply happened to share a religion, a royal line, and a river? For most of the 20th century, nobody could answer that question with real, comprehensive evidence. One man thought he already knew. His name was Bernard-Philippe Grolier. Born in Phnom Penh in 1926, the son of an earlier scholar of Cambodian art and history, Grolier spent much of his life in the country his father had studied before him. He became a member of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, the French school of the Far East, in 1951, and served as curator of the Angkor monuments from 1959 until 1975. Those were not easy years to hold that position. Through Cambodia's deepening civil war in the early 1970s, Grolier is reported to have remained deeply concerned for the safety of the thousands of site workers and families connected to Angkor under his oversight, remaining at his post through conditions many foreign administrators would have long since abandoned. It was in 1979, drawing on decades of his own fieldwork and the partial mapping available to him, that Grolier published an argument that would become one of the most influential explanations of Angkor for a generation of scholarship afterward. He called it La Cité Hydraulique, the hydraulic city. His claim was ambitious, and it was specific. Angkor's reservoirs, canals, and embankments, he argued, were not separate, disconnected monuments scattered incidentally across the plain. They were one deliberately engineered system, built and maintained, in his account, under centralized royal authority, storing and distributing water precisely enough to sustain a population far larger than the temples alone could ever explain on their own. Later, scholars would summarize his framing of the arrangement as a kind of poison gift. The same infrastructure that had made Angkor's extraordinary rise possible, in his account, also carried within it the seeds of what would eventually come apart. The mapping available to him remained incomplete at the scale his hypothesis actually required. Grolier was arguing for a system spread across hundreds of square kilometers based on decades of partial survey and his own accumulated professional judgment, not on a complete empirical picture of the whole landscape. The evidence needed to test the system at the scale he proposed simply did not exist yet for anyone in 1979. He knew that limitation himself. In his own writing, Grolier was careful to note that the specific question of rice irrigation, whether these reservoirs actually watered the fields that fed the city's enormous population, was only one part of a much larger claim about the landscape as an integrated whole, even if it was the part he personally emphasized most, and the part that would later prove most contested. That closeness to the landscape gave his argument unusual weight. This was not a speculative essay written from a distance. It was the considered judgment of someone who had spent decades physically walking this terrain and overseeing restoration at some of its most significant temples. The hydraulic city became one of the most influential explanations of Angkor's growth and decline for an entire generation of scholarship that followed him. A system this vast, this centrally controlled, so the argument went, was also a system capable of collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. It was also, within a single year of its publication, directly and specifically challenged. In 1980, a researcher named W.J. van Liere published a pointed technical objection to Groslier's theory. His argument was specific, not sweeping. Van Liere pointed to something concrete. He argued that Angkor's large ceremonial waterworks lacked any demonstrated technical connection to ordinary agricultural water management. No confirmed outlets or distribution channels linking the great reservoirs directly to the surrounding rice fields. Without that physical connection, a reservoir capable of storing enormous volumes of water is not automatically capable of functioning as the backbone of a large-scale irrigation economy, whatever its scale suggests from a distance. It was a real technical critique from someone who understood the engineering involved. For years, nobody could definitively answer it either way. The problem was not that the evidence contradicted Grolier outright. The problem was that the evidence, in any complete form, simply did not exist yet. Cambodia's own civil war and the years of isolation that followed made sustained field survey extraordinarily difficult, and for long periods impossible, through most of the 1970s and 80s. Researchers on both sides of the debate were arguing, in the words of later scholars, largely at cross purposes, because the landscape beyond Angkor's temples had simply never been mapped in enough detail for anyone to know with real confidence which parts of each argument the landscape could actually support. That began to change in 1999. Christophe Potier, working with the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, completed a detailed archaeological map of Angkor's southern and central regions, built from ground survey, aerial photography, and years of painstaking field work. His mapping removed one of the strongest empirical foundations for Van Liere's specific objection. The great reservoirs, it turned out, did have inlets and outlets connected to a real network of channels and embankments. The physical connections Van Liere had said were unproven were now visible in the landscape, though what those connections actually meant for rice irrigation at scale remained an open question. Potier's work covered only part of Angkor's true extent. What came next covered considerably more. Starting in the early 2000s, an international team, the Greater Angkor Project, combining Australian, Cambodian, and French researchers, extended that mapping using additional field survey, aerial photography, and airborne radar data acquired in partnership with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. In 2007, the team, led by archaeologist Damien Evans, alongside Potier, Roland Fletcher, and several colleagues, published the result: a comprehensive archaeological map of a study area approaching 3,000 square kilometers. Not all of that area was continuously urbanized city. Much of it was the dispersed, low-density mix of settlement and agriculture already described in this documentary. But the map gave researchers, for the first time, a genuinely landscape-scale picture of how Angkor's water network actually fit together. What that map showed confirmed one of Grolier's central insights, decades after he first proposed it. The hydraulic features scattered across Angkor's landscape belonged to a single, immense, interconnected system, not a scatter of unrelated monuments. Bernard-Philippe Grolier died in Paris in May of 1986. He did not live to see it. But confirming the shape of the network is not the same as confirming everything Grolier claimed about it. And here, the researchers who did the confirming were careful, in a way popular retellings of this story have often not been since. The 2007 mapping team stated directly that their findings should redirect the conversation well beyond the narrower question of whether this network was actually used to irrigate rice at scale. That specific claim, Grolier's own emphasis, remained genuinely unresolved, even after the landscape's true physical extent was finally confirmed. A further advance came in 2012 when a different remote sensing tool was deployed above the forest canopy, airborne LiDAR. Where the earlier radar survey had been essential for establishing the network's broad structure across a vast area, LiDAR's particular strength lay in resolving far finer bare earth topography beneath dense vegetation, recovering subtle features that ground survey and radar alone had struggled to pick out clearly. Published in 2013, this LiDAR campaign revealed previously unmapped microtopographic detail across large areas in a single survey, including new clarity on the early city on Phnom Kulen described earlier in this documentary. Radar and LiDAR were not competing technologies, one simply better than the other. They were complementary tools, each suited to a different part of the same unfolding project, arriving in sequence rather than as a single moment of sudden revelation. Later research complicated the picture still further. A 2020 study by Sarah Klassen and Damian Evans found that Angkor's water system was not a single, centralized machine imposed uniformly from above by royal decree. It developed gradually over centuries, combining large-scale state infrastructure with smaller, local, and household-scale water management, a system assembled through many layers of authority across many generations, rather than the product of one master plan. So the honest verdict, stated as plainly as the evidence allows. Grolier was right that Angkor was a vast, deliberately engineered landscape. Modern mapping confirmed the network's true scale and structure, decades after he first proposed it, using tools he never once had access to in his own working lifetime. Later research made the degree of centralized irrigation and the balance between royal and local management substantially more complicated than Grolier's original model allowed for. The landscape he described was real. The theory that first saw it whole was not entirely correct in every particular. Both of those things are true at once. A century before the events that would eventually reshape Angkor itself, another Khmer capital had already shown how vulnerable royal ambition could become when monumental water engineering failed. In the year 921, a king named Jayavarman IV established a rival royal center, roughly 80 kilometers northeast of Angkor, at a site called Ko Kher. For a time, the two centers coexisted, before Ko Kher became the empire's sole capital from 928 to 944. There, among scores of temples and newly constructed roads, Jayavarman's engineers built a vast new reservoir called the Rahal. It failed almost immediately. Researchers using ground-penetrating radar, publishing their findings in the journal Geoarchaeology, mapped the reservoir's buried spillway in careful detail. Their calculations of water flow showed the spillway was inadequate for the actual volume flowing in from its catchment area, a design flaw serious enough, they argue, to have substantially caused the reservoir's dike to fail, possibly within the very first rainy season after construction was complete. Political centrality returned to Angkor in 944. The researchers themselves are careful about how far to take the connection between the two events. The reservoir's failure, they write, may have contributed to Ko Kher's remarkably short tenure as the empire's center. Not proof of a direct cause, a plausible, evidence-grounded interpretation, stated with real and explicit caution by the people who did the actual mapping. What the Ko Kher episode suggests, at minimum, is that effective water management was materially important to the viability of a royal capital. By the reign of Jayavarman VII, beginning in 1181, Angkor's own water system had been growing, layer upon layer, for roughly 300 years. Jayavarman VII built new temples across the breadth of the empire, including Bayon and Ta Prohm, alongside major hydraulic works of his own, among them a reservoir called the Jayatataka. He stands as one of the most prolific builders in Angkorian history. By his reign, the hydraulic landscape he inherited was already centuries old and increasingly complex. Centuries later still, that accumulated complexity met a genuine climatic crisis. Tree ring records from Vietnam, analyzed by climate scientists including Brendan Buckley, reveal severe, decades-long droughts across the late 14th and early 15th centuries, punctuated by episodes of intense monsoon flooding. Not a gradual decline in rainfall, but violent swings between extremes. Shocks of that severity pushed a centuries-old network into conditions its accumulated structure handled poorly. A separate study modeled Angkor's actual 13th century water network directly, a large, interconnected system of canals, embankments, and reservoirs, to test how that specific network would respond to erosion and sedimentation under genuinely variable rainfall. In an interconnected network like this one, disruption at a single point can redirect flows and stresses elsewhere in the system. Under sufficiently extreme conditions, local damage can propagate outward, degrading performance in connected parts far removed from where it began. No single flood broke Angkor. No single drought on its own did either. What the evidence actually supports, taken together, is decades of compounding climatic and infrastructural stress. Drought, flood, sediment, and the accumulated strain of maintaining an aging, increasingly complex system, arriving and easing and returning across an extended and uneven span. Not in any single clean sequence anyone actually living through it could have fully understood or predicted at the time. Later chronicles place an Ayutthayan capture of Angkor around the year 1431. Archaeology confirms a genuine 15th century Ayutthayan presence in the region. But treating 1431 as a single, clean fall of Angkor overstates how tidy this transformation actually was on the ground. Angkor's political center had already been shifting, gradually and unevenly, for generations before this. And the causes were never limited to any one mechanism. Environmental and infrastructural strain, described in the previous section, was part of it. Ongoing political competition and warfare also mattered, a recurring feature of Khmer politics in these later centuries. Many historians also place Angkor's political relocation within a broader regional turn toward riverine and maritime commerce, which increasingly favored centers positioned farther south. How much that economic shift mattered relative to warfare, climate, and internal political change is genuinely difficult to separate. The available evidence does not let historians rank these causes cleanly against one another. Settlement patterns across the wider Angkor landscape shifted too, in ways archaeologists are still working to date precisely. Administrative and elite occupation, contracting in some areas, even while other parts of the landscape remained active. This was not a story of a single population abandoning a single city on a single day. It was an uneven contraction, spread unevenly across a landscape that had never been organized as a single dense settlement to begin with. There is direct material evidence for this uneven picture. Researchers examining Buddha imagery recovered at the Bayon identified more than 40 images belonging to a distinctly Ayutthayan style. The sculpture provides material evidence consistent with an early Ayutthayan presence at Angkor, extending beyond a single dramatic event. Researchers have proposed that this fits a roughly 12 to 15-year period of occupation, while cautioning that the exact political history cannot be read from the statues alone. Angkor's post-imperial history was not empty space between one empire's fall and the next visitor's arrival. It had its own occupants, its own activity, its own unresolved chapters. One detail is worth stating plainly here, because the popular version of this story usually gets it wrong. Angkor Wat was never completely abandoned. Archaeological evidence shows renewed activity at occupation mounds within the temple enclosure from the late 14th and early 15th centuries onward, continuing across a much longer span afterward. Portuguese travelers described the temple in written accounts as early as the 1550s. Japanese pilgrims left inscriptions at Angkor Wat in the 17th century. A Japanese plan of the complex also survives from that period. Some of those visitors understood Angkor through the geography of Buddhist India, identifying the temple with Jetavana, a sacred site described in Buddhist scripture. That continuity did not simply preserve an empty ruin. Over the centuries that followed political decline, Angkor Wat's religious identity itself changed, from its origins as a Hindu state temple built at the command of a 12th century king to an increasingly important site of Theravada Buddhist worship and pilgrimage, a role it still holds today. By at least the 16th century, art historical and inscriptional evidence points to Angkor Wat's emergence as an important Buddhist pilgrimage destination in its own right. New Buddhist imagery added directly into the temple's older Hindu galleries, physical evidence of a living, changing religious institution rather than a frozen monument. In the 16th century, Khmer rulers returned significant attention to Angkor Wat. Scholars associate King Ang Chan with the completion of unfinished reliefs in the temple's northeastern gallery, while separate inscriptions from later in the same century record further royal renovation. Knowledge of Ang Chan's own reign remains fragmentary, and not every restoration at the site traces cleanly to him alone. What the physical evidence does show clearly is that this work did not simply erase the temple's Hindu past. New carving continued older Brahmanical narratives already on the walls, even as Buddhist worship expanded through the complex alongside it. Later inscriptions, restorations, and additions to the temple complex, made long after Angkor's political peak, trace this transformation directly. A temple built to serve one king's religious and political program, gradually absorbed into a different, enduring tradition that outlasted the empire that built it. When the French naturalist Henri Mouhot wrote about Angkor in the 1860s, sparking a wave of Western fascination that continues in various forms to this day, he did not discover Angkor. Portuguese and other European visitors had already written about it 3 centuries earlier. What Mouhot's account did was make the site famous to a much wider 19th century European readership than had ever engaged with it before. Angkor had never vanished from Cambodian life. What changed in the centuries after its political peak was how distant outsiders imagined it, and eventually, how much of the outside world came to know it existed at all. And that brings this story back to where it began, with an argument made by one man decades before anyone alive could actually prove or disprove it. Bernard-Philippe was right that Angkor was never simply a collection of temples standing in isolation. It was, as he insisted for decades, his model influential and, in time, genuinely controversial, a vast and deliberately engineered landscape, reservoirs, canals, embankments, and settlements, accumulated through successive royal foundations that repeatedly reworked what earlier rulers had built. Modern mapping, using technology entirely unimaginable in his own working lifetime, confirmed the immense, interconnected landscape that lay at the heart of his argument. He was on less certain ground in assigning centralized rice irrigation such a central role in the system, and in treating hydraulic overextension as a sufficient explanation for Angkor's decline. The truth, once the evidence finally caught up with the theory, turned out to be considerably more complicated than either his sharpest critics or his own strongest claims had allowed for. He died in 1986 in Paris, working from decades of field experience but without the landscape-scale datasets that would later test his own theory. He did not live to see the confirmation arrive. He did not see the complication that came with it, either. Return for a moment to the water. The West Beret still sits where Angkorian engineers placed it nearly 1,000 years ago. From the shore, its scale is still deceptive. 1,000 years of change have passed across it, in its depth, in its use, in what surrounds it. But the great rectangle remains, still holding water, still drawn on today. The West Mebon still rises, barely, from the small island at its center, just as it was built to do. What has changed most is what we understand the reservoir to be. It is not a monument standing apart from a city, but one visible fragment of a much larger argument about how an entire civilization organized itself around water, an argument made decades ago by a man who spent much of his working life certain of something he could never quite fully prove, and confirmed, imperfectly and with real complications attached, only after he was no longer alive to hear it. The temples are only part of Angkor. They always were. Thank you for drifting with us tonight. New journeys every week.